This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
A Kia SUV is capable of taking you far. But when you use it locally to help your community, you go even further. Whether that's carrying cargo, bringing your team with you, ready, or navigating new terrain. Power up your capability with the right Kia SUV. Do more with the Kia Sportage, Kia Telluride, Kia Sorento, or Kia Seltos. Kia. Movement that inspires. Call 800-333-4KIA for details. Always drive safely.
Long ago in northwestern China, near the oasis town of Dunhuang, humans carved a series of caves deep into a mountainside. An impressive feat of engineering set in a dramatic landscape. A sacred place.
There was a monk 1,000 years ago. He went there and saw this when the sun shines shining on the mountains and see the river that is running in front of the cliff face. He found that, okay, this is such a good place, it's such a sacred place that he can do meditation. This is why the first cave was carved on this cliff face.
Over time, Dunhuang, with its caves, 500 in total, became an important place for pilgrims and also merchants and travellers. Sandwiched between the Himalayas and the Mongolian steppe, it acted as a corridor for generations of people who journeyed east and west.
The Mogao caves are the Buddhist sacred sites, which is very related to Dunhuang because everybody that's come to Dunhuang, travel through Dunhuang, they will pray here, they must visit here. It's kind of just like the Big Ben in London, so everybody would go there.
One of these caves, now known as Cave 17, was a library. How and why it was created remains a mystery, but it contained 50,000 items, among them precious manuscripts. In the 11th century, Cave 17 was walled off and the library remained hidden for 1,000 years. Just a century ago, a guardian of the cave noticed smoke drifting through a small gap in the wall.
Just discovered the cave. Oh my God, there's a cave up there when he was doing the dusting type of things.
So there was a sealed wall behind which were manuscripts.
Yeah, but actually he doesn't really know about the how precious are these items. That's why there were different stories of the dispersal and selling of the items to foreign explorer.
Some of the manuscripts made their way to the British Library, and over the next few months are on display in an exhibition, A Silk Road Oasis, Life in Ancient Dunhuang. In fact, this music is a specially commissioned piece for the exhibition. The reason the contents of Cave 17 are so important and fascinating is they make vivid lives lived in a part of what we now refer to as the Silk Roads. The complex, overlapping networks of trade and communication that connected East Asia with Eurasia and onto Europe and even parts of Africa. And an important part of that story was, of course, food.
Here you can see those words in red, means like oil or flour.
Among the manuscripts are lists of ingredients made by cooks in households planning to feed visitors who'd travelled along the Silk Roads.
This is something that, okay, how many people are coming and what bread we will support to them. So for example here, okay, we will support them with 50 or 30 of this type of bread for their visit.
British Library curator Kitty Liu on the enduring fascination of stories from the Silk Roads. Meanwhile, running in parallel at the British Museum is another exhibition dedicated to the Silk Road, which brings together rare items from China, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, India, the Middle East and across Europe, all helping to illustrate how long our world has been interconnected. Globalization, as these exhibitions remind us, happened long ago. The Silk Roads and other waves of globalization have shaped how we live, how we think, and how we eat. And they've also helped determine human impact on the planet. It's these themes we'll be exploring in this edition, all with the help of a historian and writer whose books have helped make sense of these big waves of history.
Peter Frankopan is a historian who likes to take on big ideas, sweeping across many centuries and national boundaries.
He is an expert on the history of the Mediterranean, the Balkans and Russia, the relations between Christianity and Islam, and medieval Greek literature.
According to the New Statesman, Peter is the history rock star du jour and author of the international bestseller The Silk Roads, A New History of the World,
and how they spread ideas, culture and religion. His follow-up, The New Silk Roads, The Future and Present of the World, investigated how economic power is shifting eastwards.
And Peter's the author of The Earth Transformed,
which traces the long history of climate and its impact on civilizations across the world.
And asks us to think more about floods, volcanoes and potatoes when we consider the careers of Genghis Khan or Cleopatra.
Bottom line is that, like most of us on this planet, I'm so deeply curious and maybe even concerned about food, about resources, around water, around climatic changes, what that means for the 21st century. So I suppose if you read them as a parallel, I suppose Silk Roads is about the rise of Asia for the challenges and opportunities it gives us. And Earth Transformed, I suppose, it's about that changing natural environment around us and the challenges and opportunities that it gives us. And those two, I suppose, are the two twin big questions of the 21st century, assuming we don't have asteroid strikes, nuclear war, catastrophic pandemics, which are, but of course, quite closely linked to both of those two topics too.
Peter Frankopan's books, including The Silk Roads, The New Silk Roads, and most recently, The Earth Transformed, aren't explicitly food books. But they've all changed my thinking about the role of food in human history. They've also helped me understand how the big shifts in Earth history explain so much about how the world eats. And so, this edition, Frankopan on Food, will explore his work and ideas through the lens of food, which I think makes complete sense because without food, well, there would be no history.
If you boil history down to its real bricks, calories and water, energy and disease environments, I guess those are the kind of four things that you need in your ideal personal Garden of Eden. People can talk about exchange of elite goods, silk, for example, or gold and so on, materials in the modern age, I suppose, oil and gas and copper, lithium, you name it. But there's something fundamental, I think, about the ecological envelope in which you live and how sustainable that is.
Peter, your work has taken you all over the world, including, because of the Silk Roads and the Byzantine Empire, Central Asia, a less familiar region to most of us. But what has that meant for your own food experiences?
Food and sound are such important parts of visiting somewhere new. And so in Central Asia, I got exposed quite early on to the enjoyment of horse as a food, and then thinking, okay, well, there are lots of parts of the world where people are really discomforted by the idea of pork or to eat, or of eating lamb. In East Asian cultures, the idea you murder and kill a small sheep is anomalous. And to realise, well, the way in which we classify animals is obviously highly localised, and our Western way is our Western way, and other people do things differently. But horse in Central Asia, lots of different kinds of flavours and sausages. And then shubat, very sour camel milk that's white and foamy, and sends the hairs up the back of my neck for quite a few days, actually. It's an unbelievably powerful taste and very strong.
But when it comes to experiencing food, I understand you have a slight disadvantage.
I lost my sense of smell about 30 years ago, probably mainly to do with dust mites from books in the Bodleian Library. So every now and again smells get through, so my taste can't be as good as it should be. But, there are people who've got worse issues to deal with their health.
In The Earth Transformed, he explores the way in which the environment and climate, from volcanoes to droughts, have shaped the world and human history. And that includes the very beginnings of farming.
The start of the Holocene, let's say 10, 11,000 years ago, something like that, sees a change of conditions in different parts of the world. But I suppose it's not a great surprise that those matter where there are populations that have already found niches that work well. And the most obvious one is the Fertile Crescent in what's now the Middle East.
In the Fertile Crescent, which includes modern-day Iraq, Iran, Israel and Syria, humans had long been interacting with wild plants, eating their roots and seeds, including those of members of the grass family, which through a long process of domestication eventually gave us today's wheat and barley. It's easy to focus on human agency in this process, but perhaps the most important driver of change was climate. As the last ice age gave way to the more benign Holocene, more humans left behind hunting and gathering to become farmers.
At that time, we see a whole set of changes that are to do with the Earth coming out of a cooling phase into a warming process and changes to the carbon dioxide and carbon patterns atmospherically that are perhaps more beneficial to the growth and acceleration of growth of maybe some plants, maybe even lots of plants. But one of the signatures is around about that time, we see a rise in population levels. And those are slow and modest to start with. By around about 8,000 BCE, about maybe 10,000 years ago, you start to see the first deliberate cultivations of crops.
At roughly the same time as this was happening in the Fertile Crescent, humans in other parts of the world were also interacting with plants in different ways. In the Yangtze River basin of China, this included rice and soy, and in central Mexico, it included maize, beans, and squash. Farming arrived, food changed, and so did the way humans organised themselves.
One of the first things that happens, it's a big argument amongst anthropologists, is that the start of farming, in whatever meaningful word that means, presumably has some kind of correlation to the development of ideas about personal property, and particularly about land ownership, because it's advantageous to own the best land. The best land has the best soils, the best ability to irrigate, natural or otherwise, and that then those things will start to magnify hierarchies. And of course, the key question when it comes to larger populations is availability of a labour force. One of the ideas around why many of the cities in Mesopotamia, for example, have very substantial fortifications and walls, far greater than any military capability to assault them or besiege them, was not to keep enemies away, but to keep labour forces in. And that seems quite a stark idea, I think, around that what really matters is not just can you feed the mouths, but can you control a workforce that can generate agricultural production and surplus. So I think that would speak to an anxiety around how do you get people to work in the fields to produce and to grow crops and to look after animals. And slavery, indentured labour, the ability to get a workforce to work either for free, through racial grounds, through enslavement, bondage, or at the lowest possible cost, is something that is a constant throughout our history as humans, going back thousands of years.
In all of Peter Frankopan's books, including The Silk Roads and Earth Transformed, the way humans move around the world and interact, sometimes through conflict, often through trade, is of particular interest. And again, food can reveal so much to us.
The kind of signature and best way to look at the dissemination of foods is actually the walnut, because we can see walnut forests being planted, and therefore you can date them. So and walnut shells are very robust as well, unlike sort of apple pips. You can find fossilised pits. In fact, a colleague of mine at Cambridge, Daniel Fuchs, has been working on refuse pits in the Abbasid Empire, or the great Arab Empire in what's now Palestine, where you can see what people are eating, some of it you can measure and date, you can see how diets are changing and so on. But so it's quite hard to track individual foods that don't leave good fossilised remains or don't leave their shells or aren't planted. The walnut trees you can see sort of blossoming, connecting along these silk roads, which are showing you where people are travelling. And in a way, where they don't get grown tells you as much as where they do, because it shows that people aren't going to areas X and Y, and they are, for whatever reason, travelling on different routes. So foods can be really, really important markers to show genetic migrations. They can then start to, again, clever colleagues who might have been doing this, mapping walnut forests and the distribution of Proto-Indo-European languages. The word for walnut is more or less the same, jayak, in just about all the languages across Central Asia, which suggests that people are planting or exchanging walnuts deliberately. So there's some information exchange. That's one thing. Second is the distribution of walnut forests themselves. You don't find concentric growth of walnut forests, as you might expect if walnut forests were growing and seeding themselves naturally, but you find them being what looks like they're being planted. And so you can therefore have some idea around what kind of levels of exchange there are between different regions, but also in the kind of fanning out effect as people become more intensive in their cooperation, negotiations, competitions. They aren't just bringing goods and then turning around and heading home. They're bringing their languages, they're bringing their foods, they're bringing their genes, they're bringing their new ideas.
The 15th century saw the arrival of the first Europeans in the Americas. The world was transformed again. The so-called Columbian exchange between the old world and new saw a transfer of crops and animals that would change landscapes and diets at a global level.
It's amazing, isn't it? We think about Indian food and we think about chilies. We think about pineapples and sweetness of pineapple juice that we might think from Southeast Asia, or potatoes, a classic Sunday lunch. But those are all from South America. And the ways in which foods have been moved around and grown in different locations, it doesn't just transform our habitats, it transforms whole ecosystems. The biodiversity changes when you put new crops in new locations. And some of the things that unfortunately were hugely significant in the rise of European empires was not just the cultivation of crops that were particularly important and valuable, like tobacco and cotton and sugar, but the human resources that were required to make those work. They're labour intensive. It changed through mass movements of people, migrations that didn't just happen with the slavery of transatlantic slavery, which I find very difficult to read about, let alone write about, but also massive migrations in East Asia that we don't spend much time thinking about too, of relocations of populations to Mauritius and Réunion to build sugar plantations in the 19th centuries, or of people from China and India into Polynesia and the South Pacific on an enormous scale, tens of millions of people moving. And most of those movements of people are to do with food cultivation. Later on, it becomes railway building and other kinds of industrialization. But I suppose that's partly because the point of empire is all about natural resources and almost always has a food element to it.
This phase of globalization and the discovery of new crops brought dramatic change not only to the British diet but also its status in the world. These newly discovered foods fed its rise as an empire, and through naval power, its reach across the planet was extended.
There's a latrine in Bristol where sailors, when they came back from their travels, would do what sailors do when they come back from their travels. And the fundament is many meters deep, and you can tell what people are eating. You can tell what kind of parasites they're carrying from looking at the different levels within the fundament there.
Fascinating story of the sailors. I mean, what did we learn from recent analysis of what they deposited on the return home?
Well, so there's a parallel latrine in Lubeck, so you can see what levels of exchange there are between Bristol and ports in the Hanseatic and the North Sea. You can see how far people are starting to eat things that are coming from the Caribbean. You're able to see how far people are picking up diseases and what they're eating from West Africa and even beyond. And you can date this stuff. That's the amazing thing too. So you can see the transformations of how people's diets are changing, and because they're regular sailors, you can then start to track and start to ask questions around how these goods and crops and foodstuffs and also diseases, parasites, finding their way into wider communities in the British Isles, for example. And that kind of entry point allows a kind of new frame to be able to look through what ways that Britain went from being an isolated island in North Atlantic into a maritime global empire where people were starting to move around genes, not just of our own species, but of pathogens and foods as well.
To build an empire requires energy, and for the British and other European powers, a source of fuel for their populations originated in the Andes and indigenous farmers in Peru: the potato.
It even plays a role in urbanisation, particularly in Europe, but also in other parts of the world too, and in reducing threats and occurrences of conflict, which were already substantial. But the potato is a kind of miracle crop. It has more calories, vitamins and nutrients per acre than just about any other staple crop, about 3 times more energy per acre than wheat or oats or barley, but also carries vitamins like vitamin C, 45% of a daily input of vitamin C in a single medium-sized potato, plus vitamin B6, riboflavin, niacin, and so on. And when the potato got spread to different parts of the world, it didn't just make calorie consumption of humans easier because it's resilient. It's quite a low input type of crop to both plant and then sit and wait and then harvest, but also was great for easy to store and survives for quite a long time in storage. And also, on top of all of that, is good for fodder for animals. So that means that your protein availability of animals goes up too. So it had a hugely significant role in the 1600s onwards in helping drive some of those things to make the exposure to shocks to go down. So the way the potato, I'd slightly dramatically say it changed the world, but I think it really was a key driver of globalization and also of a way in which the ability to have more time to do other things played a role in some of those things like urbanization in Europe, where because of our climatic envelope, we in Europe could build bigger and bigger cities. That wasn't so easy in places like the Ottoman Empire, where water availability is much lower, disease environments and the ability to deal with things like plague and pathogens, a constant reoccurrence. So the number of cities in the Ottoman Empire in 1500 and 1800 didn't change, nor did their size, at a time when in Europe we saw massive urbanization that changes the socioeconomics and also ultimately ends up changing the climate once we start burning lots of carbon.
And just place the potato in the context of the idea of reducing conflict? The
logic of reducing conflict is that if you have lower input on your land and you have more reliable food crops, it stands to reason that the value of land will go down. And if the value of land goes down, then presumably the ability and the need to fight for it will decline because land has lower value.
As well as fueling population growth, industrialisation and urbanisation, the potato and other new crops made expansion of the British Empire possible. By the mid-19th century, when India came under its control, the colonists were transforming food systems across South Asia, planting vast areas of wheat in the Punjab and further north in Assam, tea.
As far as the British and their experience of India goes, I mean, they're trying to do multiple different things. Of course, the point of empire is to take stuff away and bring it back to the centre. You know, that's the point. It often gets dressed up in the context of trying to spread civilization or trade or sophistication or culture. But, you know, that's not how we tend to think about things today as historians. The Punjab is sort of identified as a potential wheat basket, and at least to start with, the building of canals and of water supplies that are supposed to create something spectacular ends up as being one of the great agricultural and demographic own goals in history, where millions of people are transported to go and grow things. It looks like it works for the first couple of years, then yields fall way below expectations, and suddenly you have a region that was already reasonably stressed, hyper-stressed, because there are too many people living in it to be able to sustain themselves. And so that's one element. As far as the tea goes, I mean, I suppose you could see the movement of tea as one of the great thefts of intellectual property in world history, where tea is taken from China by Britain and then brought to Assam and Bengal and grown in quantities that are then used to exchange for opium that underpin the rise of the fortunes of many of the great families of the United Kingdom in the 19th century. So the cultivations of tea, of opium, of their transport backwards and forth, of resettlement of populations into Punjab, which then suffer by being split into two by partition. You know, those are things that we, the British, have to work out. How do we atone, apologise, or at least understand that we were responsible for things that otherwise wouldn't have happened?
When it comes to the fate of empires, why do some endure when others fail? Using food as a lens, can you identify the strategies of success and failure? For Peter Frankopan, from his time as an undergraduate to his work today, one of the most fascinating case studies has been the Byzantine Empire, with Constantinople as its capital, modern-day Istanbul.
I went to a lecture my last year at university. I wasn't sure which paper to pick. And my supervisor, my professor, Jonathan Shepherd, stood up and gave a lecture that was absolutely breathtakingly brilliant, talking about Constantinople and its connections with Scandinavia, Iceland, southern Spain, North Africa, Baghdad, and pre-Mongol nomads in Central Asia. And I just thought it's the best thing I've ever heard. But I just thought, I've never heard any of this before. That was one thing. Second, it sounds unbelievably interesting. And third, it actually sounds quite important. So I came back home, had a cup of coffee with my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and I just said, I've just had my socks blown off.
Years of research followed, with a focus on the influence and interactions of an empire that few others can match for longevity. So, when it comes to its food system, what did the Byzantines get right?
The Byzantine Empire puts about 1,000 years on, more than 1,000 years on the clock. And that would suggest that rather than how we tend to use the word Byzantine today in a kind of over-elaborate smoke and mirrors, too much red tape, would speak to a bureaucracy that in fact is extremely well run and is extremely aware of the fact that there needs to be abilities to have some slack in the system for when there's a crisis. And I can promise you, as a specialist in the Byzantine Empire, they don't always get it right, but they get it right much more often than they get it wrong. And to do that over a multi-climatic region, multilingual, multi-ethnic and spread over large distances speaks to really good planning. The key is, of course, to have well-trained bureaucrats. And there's a fantastic text written in the 10th century called the Book of the Eparch, which is a sort of set of regulations for how trade goes on in the capital city. It's a bit anomalous. It's the only kind of example we have, so there are obviously difficulties of interpreting it. But it sets out the ways in which people are allowed to trade and what happens to people who rip off their customers. So there are official agents of the city mayor, effectively the eparch, who go around making sure that trade is being done fairly. And if it's not being done fairly, you have your head shaved, you're beaten and shamed, etc., etc. So regulation is an important part of it. Efficient use of bureaucracy and tax gathering, obviously important. The sort of the muscle memory of how to supply large cities, how you can get enough food, sheep, fish, bread prepared every day is important. And every loaf of bread that's being baked in Constantinople every single day needs a heat source. So it's not just about food, it's about ecologies of where do you get wood from or other burning materials. So I think that what they got right was understanding how systems work, and food system is exactly the right phrase here. I think it's nothing happens by chance, and well thought through, well established, well run bureaucracies that appoint on merit proved to be highly enduring, and in fact lasted for, like you said, a millennium, which is unprecedented. I mean, they inherited a lot of this. I mean, it really is the Roman Empire, just by another name. So this is not just developed in Byzantium or Constantinople. It's sort of systems that have allowed an empire to flourish. And that's about expending your resources and gathering them correctly and being able to measure sustainability. So the emperor, for example, has protected zones where people aren't allowed to cut down trees, or he's able to decide, or sometimes she is able to decide on what comes from them. But securing your crops is absolutely central.
But all things must pass, including empires. And with the Byzantines, the impressive reach of its food system across huge swathes of the world contributed to its fall.
Food is one of the primary transmitters of the Black Death in the 1340s. It travels, we think of it as it's all to do with rats, with fleas jumping off them, but the fleas are also carried in wool, but also in wheat. And so wheat is probably the primary route by which the Black Death reaches markets in Europe. Decimates populations. In the case of Byzantium, probably like the rest of Europe, we're looking at fatality rates of maybe 30-40% of the population. So suddenly you have a sort of double-headed spear that comes as a result. On the one hand, if lots of people die, everything's much cheaper. There are fewer people who are going to buy horses. Fewer people are going to buy the nice houses, and so things sort of that you get more bang for your buck. On the other hand, labour intensivity goes down because there are fewer people who can collect things from the fields. So there's an agrarian crisis that comes. It's triggered by a few other things as well. Arrival of the Mongols, arrivals of the Ottoman Turks, the military pressures, etc., etc. But I think that the key in the case of the fall of the Byzantine Empire is depopulation is a key part of that. Lots of scholars write about it as though it's imperial exhaustion, but you need manpower to be able to hold your breath. And ideally you have increasing populations, because that allows you to have more mouths to feed and more people to be able to work. So the Black Death in the 1340s, I think, is crucial to the story. It takes a long time, though. It's only 1453 before Constantinople falls.
But for most of its history, the leaders of the Byzantine Empire were aware that managing their impact on their environment was crucial to survival.
There have been many periods in the past where human activities have clearly changed and impacted the environment. And for example, in the 17th and 18th century, settlers in North America were extremely concerned and anxious about the fact that human settlement and settlement of Europeans, and particularly their practices of deforestation to clear land, were changing rainfall patterns in a substantial way. And in fact, you find that in the ancient Greek world too. In the Mediterranean, 2,500 years ago, writers saying if you cut down trees, you change how much rain falls and where it falls. So humans have always been extremely concerned, as well as interested in, around how do our lifestyle patterns have effects that influence the natural environment around us, and not just about soil chemistry and what we grow, but also in the celestial, in the patterns of rainfall and drought and so on. And I suppose one of the reasons that religions start to rise up in different parts of the world at different times is that priests are trying to be intercessors, often with the divine. And of course, the divine is usually up in the skies one way or another in most belief systems, partly because that's where rain comes from and the sun bakes you down. So some of those interpretations and explanations, offerings to gods to try to be propitious and win their favour, punishments of individual leaders who are removed from power because they oversee bad conditions, those and how moral behaviour is connected into punishments, takes us back to the sort of flood of Noah, where God devastates the humans because, well, take your pick, we're immoral, we're unkind, we behave too noisily. And the story of the flood of Noah doesn't just appear in the Bible and the Torah, and of course in the Quran too, but also in Mesopotamian chronicles from 3,000-4,000 years ago. So that idea that humans can somehow influence and be rewarded or punished through their behaviour, but also because their activities changes the climate around them, is something that has a very, very long history.
In his book, The Silk Roads, Peter Frankopan also highlights how rival powers have used food as a weapon of war, including Germany's ambitions to take control of Soviet wheat supplies. Nazi military planners saw this as crucial not only to victory, but also Germany's long-term food security. If successful, this plan would have resulted in the starvation of millions of Ukrainians and Russians.
I wanted to look at what it was that the invasion of the Soviet Union in particular and the push eastwards into the Middle East, what that meant for to how we understand the Second World War. And when I was working on it, I then started to come across documents that explained that the German war plan for the Soviet Union was to split the Soviet Union into a surplus zone and a deficit zone. And the deficit zone, more or less to the north, including Moscow and St. Petersburg, places that were forests and didn't offer any upsides for the German economy. But the southern areas, what's now Ukraine, offered almost unlimited wheat. And Hitler drew parallels about the German conquests of what's now southern Ukraine and southern Russia with the opening up of the Great Plains in North America, that this would provide a breadbasket that would allow Germans to never have to worry about their food supplies. And so that had been sort of set up reasonably early in the 1930s. But by the time the war got going, it was acutely obvious to German military planners that food was a problem inside Germany and for German troops. And in particular, and eventually when the Germans started to take large numbers of Soviet prisoners of war. And so calories get cut quite early on to Soviet prisoners of war. And then the originators of the Holocaust, people like Adolf Eichmann, suggest that, well, rather than giving a prisoner of war 500 calories, which is not a lot to survive on, wouldn't it just be better to shoot and murder the prisoners of war? And that soon goes to how do you do that better and more efficiently? And that turns to the use of Zyklon B, first used on Soviet prisoners, and then that starts to get used in death camps in Poland and Germany and elsewhere. So one of the stories, I think, was about the importance of food to German military planning and thinking, and then the horrors of the German miscalculation and the aggression towards these peoples in Ukraine, that when that all went wrong, there was a price to pay. And there's a chilling single document where estimates are made for what will happen when the Germans invade the Soviet Union to the surplus zone and start to take the food away from the citizens who live there. And the German military planners say there will be X million people who will starve to death and will die from hunger. And the German military planners send that back and go, X is not a number, you need to define it. And they come back with a second document and they say, we expect total number of deaths from starvation to be around 10 million people because there'll be too little food. And I think it was important to tell that because that's a sideshow really to the Holocaust, the suffering, the persecutions. But it's an important part, I think, of rounding out history to include lots of different factors that are not trying to compete with other narratives, but supplement them.
But what of today? As Peter Frankopan said earlier, this century is one in which we're witnessing the rise of Asia. And there's a food component here as well. With its eye on the future and its growing population, as with the Byzantine Empire 1,000 years ago, China is making plans.
So in 2013, Xi Jinping announced something called the One Belt, One Road Initiative. It's now formally named the Belt and Road Initiative by China. That is on the surface all about how people should cooperate with each other and work together based from learning from past episodes of histories where ethnicities, religions, languages were no barrier to trade. And on the surface, it's a benign, wonderful way of trying to get everybody to work together. But China's announcement was a kind of signature moment that went hand in hand with China being much more visibly active in foreign affairs, in energy, in defence, in global politics, and more strident on the international stage because China's muscles have grown extremely rapidly over the last 30 years. The numbers of what's been invested, where and how, it's a little bit, choose which numbers you want, and some a little bit more opaque than others. But the initiative was really to try to galvanise investment in infrastructure outside China in countries that could benefit from Chinese capital and infrastructure investment. And it's sort of sent the shockwaves through policy planners in the UK, the US and elsewhere to think that this is China trying to make the world in its own image. And food is a part of that too. That the idea of future buying crops, which China has been doing, particularly in Latin America, is one way of using the market to provide some form of security.
As the balance of power around the world shifts again, and with it influence and affluence, there are pressures that no nation can easily escape, including the fact that some of the most basic resources underpinning food and farming systems are now running out. And there's one in particular that doesn't receive enough attention, but is of great concern to Peter Frankopan. It's water.
I don't want to be pessimistic nor add my name to those who predicted the end of the world since the beginning of time, but it looks quite precarious to me. I mean, we've seen violent confrontation, including deaths on the border between Iran and Afghanistan over water rights. Central Asia, a region that's highly exposed to water shortages, already we see pretty bleak ideas around what was going to happen to glaciers and to water supply in the next, not 100 years, but in the next 20 or 30 years. So much groundwater has been taken out of the northern plains in India that the position of the North and the South Pole have moved. And I think that those kinds of things would make one slightly concerned about the fragilities of systems that can't generate responses. But, the show does stay on the road for the time being. But, I think that fresh water, I'm not the only person who's concerned about that. I mean, the head of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has said that we are committing collective suicide in our treatment of water, but also that the consumption of water has reached vampiric levels. So even here in the UK, where it rains regularly, as we know, water consumption is due to rise by 40% by the end of the decade. And that, I think, puts pressure on reservoirs. The reservoirs in Istanbul, home to 22 million people, 2 of the 3 main reservoirs are running at below 4% of their capacity. And, you don't need a historian to tell you that if you run out of water, you can solve it for a certain amount of time through bottled water. But that's for drinking, but it becomes hard to run industries. It becomes hard to cook. It becomes hard to clean yourself. So that pressure on water looks to me perhaps even more important than global climate warming.
Finally, you've said, as a historian, I know that the best way to address complex problems is to look back in time. I'm just wondering, there are schools of thought which, with new technologies that couldn't have been imagined not even decades ago, really, that the idea of more and more people can live in cities, we can use nuclear power, there's precision fermented sources of protein, and we can rewild the rest of the planet. So does that mean that we can become now disconnected from history and also from nature?
I think it depends how you want to butter your bread. I mean, if you want to be optimistic, and it's always nice to be optimistic, never bet against human ingenuity, innovation, and the ability to deal with large-scale problems. There are lots of examples in the past of how we've been able to do that, and that's why we have the longest life expectancy, best literacy levels of any point in our species' history. So, I mean, the progress we shouldn't, I think, frown on. The talk around, smart cities, clean cities, the future of cities, I think is real. I think that people are, all of them, aware that 40-degree temperatures in Northern Europe are a worry. And we've seen, in fact, ground temperatures in China above 52 and soil temperatures above 80 degrees centigrade. I think whatever one's views are about climate change, those obviously present challenge and risk. And I think the ingenuity, we shouldn't put it past us. But if you want to flip the bread over and think the other way around, the ways in which we are now more intensively connected to each other do give the capacity for the house of cards to come down very quickly. Some of the studies that have been published in the last few years around what happens to food in particular, but also to migrations, to water, to violent confrontation, really require a pretty sobering reading and require a cold, wet towel on one's head to try to process what kind of fragilities we have coming towards us. I mean, half of the world's population already lives in severe water shortage for at least 1 month of the year. And, you can stay ahead of oncoming traffic ad infinitum, but a historian probably would bet that you can't, and you can't always win. A historian would normally bet that what looks normal are those kinds of things we teach in the classroom, which are wars, disasters, plague, disease, pandemics. And, the horsemen of the apocalypse, I hope, are further away than we think, but they're always hovering on the horizon. And right now, I'd probably be on the more pessimistic side of where I think the future lies, but I really do hope I'm wrong.
Back in the British Library, at the Silk Roads exhibition, it's possible to see how people 1,000 years ago faced crises of their own.
Through this manuscript, we know actually the life 1,000 years before is quite similar to what we are having now. The concern, the wishes, people's love is basically the same as what we are having now.
Among the documents on display are some messages that were sent but never received.
These three letters are from postal bags. It was unopened. So these letters show how dangerous is the travel.
One letter is from a wife to her husband, in which she says she's been abandoned in the desert oasis, telling him she'd rather be a dog or a pig's wife than his.
You can see the translation there. She was so angry. So I did your bidding. I would rather be a dog or pig's wife than yours.
Goodness. So she feels
really
angry.
And this is of like,
I guess we don't know what happened, what the fate of the...
Yeah, we don't know what happened. We really wanted to know. Because you see the letter doesn't reach her husband. Yeah.
I'd like to think she overcame the odds and survived. And being an optimist, whatever the future holds, I'm sure we can do the same.